Hi, Scott Dreyer here at drcoaching.com and looking at part 7 of a book study of a remarkable book called Checkmate in Berlin. Checkmate in Berlin by Giles Milton. And we've been looking at, well, specifically Berlin between 1945 and 1949. So 1945 was the end of the war, end of World War II. Hitler killed himself. You had Russian, British, French, American troops come in. And so Germany was cut into 4 pieces, and also Berlin was cut into 4 pieces. And each of the victorious powers was given a section. It was supposed to be a temporary occupation until they could agree on new elections. Well, the Russians clearly wanted a Russian communist government. US, Britain, France wanted a non-communist government. The two sides could come to no agreement. And therefore, it's split into east and west. So we've been looking at how the Russians came in. There's a lot of looting originally, raping. The Russians want to take over the entire city. American and British forces came later on, and we've seen the kind of back and forth and the tussle. There was propaganda wars. There was political parties, elections held, elections canceled, this and that. We're going to come now to a very crucial part of this whole thing called the Berlin Airlift. So we're looking at Mr. Milton's book, page 241 now, 241. And we've been looking a lot at Colonel Frank Howley, who was the American commander in charge of the American sector. So here's your 4 zones: Russian, English, French, American. And this is Berlin. And notice that Berlin is deep in Russian territory. It's about 110 miles from here to here. So this French, British, American section were like a little island of freedom deep in an ocean of communism. Okay, so East Berlin and all of East Germany were controlled by the Soviet Union. So this is about Frank Howley. Howley, he soon found himself with a further battle on his hands, one with a less certain outcome. On the evening of June 23rd, 1948, the political editor of Der Tag, it was a German newspaper, Margot Derigs, was checking the final set of the newspaper's galley proofs when the newsroom clock struck 11 p.m., and she suddenly heard the teletype machine of the Soviet ADN news agency starting its characteristic tack, tack, tack. A message was coming through on the teletype paper, and it was sensational. Transport Division of the Soviet Military Administration is compelled to halt all passenger and freight traffic to and from Berlin tomorrow at 0600 hours because of technical difficulties. The Soviets were also stopping all deliveries of coal and food to the western sectors of Berlin and cutting electricity supplies. Frau Derigs knew the Russians meant business. The siege of Berlin had begun. So from 45 until 48, this little, island of freedom here had been getting their food and supplies from Western Germany. This part of Eastern Germany is actually very rich agriculturally. And so up through World War II, Berlin got most of their food from this surrounding countryside. But pretty soon after the Russians came in, the Russians made it very clear, hey, we're going to feed our own people, but for these people here, don't expect food from us. You need to feed them yourself. So all this food had to be brought in from this part of Germany, at least 100 miles away, by truck or train. This part of Berlin had about 2.4 million people. Just for your reference, that's about 24 times the size of Roanoke City, Virginia today. Roanoke City is about 100,000 people. So times 24, 2.4 million people here. And so again, their food came from this part of the country. Their coal came from this part of the country. And I've lived in Germany for a year. Winter is brutal. They burn the coal for heat. Moreover, there was an electric power company here that made about 89% of the electricity. And so very little electricity came from here. And so when the Russians cut this off, it was complete. This is called the siege. A besieged city requires a number of essentials if the inhabitants are to be kept alive. Clean drinking water is vital, as is sufficient food, fuel, and medication. An acute shortage of food cost thousands of lives during the siege of Leningrad, 1941 to 1944. And a lack of fuel caused extreme deprivation during the 1870s siege of Paris. A further requirement is the maintenance of morale. If the besieged inhabitants lose faith in their leadership, the will to resist is rapidly undermined. Western Berlin's stockpile of supplies was meager indeed in the spring of 1948. The small British garrison had enough food for 37 days, but the population of the city's western sectors, some 2.4 million people, could be fed for just 27 days. There'd be enough petrol for 10 weeks if it were severely rationed, and coal for perhaps half this time. American warehouses also contained 200 tons of condensed milk and a stockpile of powdered milk, emergency supplies that Hawley had prudently imported to the city. Yet it was nowhere near enough. A report written by General Herbert concluded that if the Soviets maintain their siege for more than a few weeks, quote, the German population will suffer considerable hardship. This was a typically British understatement. They would starve. And what had happened is, before this, by previous agreement, the Russians would sell milk to Western Berlin. So it was East German farmers had this milk, and the East German trucks would bring it in. Well, before the blockade, the Russians said, well, you can have the milk, but we're not transporting it for you. And so this American colonel had wisely realized, wow, the Russians can cut things off very quickly if they want to. So he had begun stockpiling some milk. Some, but not nearly enough for a complete siege. Grand historical parallels were uppermost in his mind, that's of Hawley, in those opening days of the siege. Quote, the cold and human mind of the Kremlin had reached a wicked decision, the most barbarous in history since Genghis Khan reduced conquered cities to pyramids of skulls. Hawley knew the closing of the land routes had marked the end of the Phoney War and the beginning of a battle for survival. Quote, June 24th, 1948 is one of the most infamous dates in the history of civilization, he wrote, adding that it was the day on which, quote, the Russians tried to murder an entire city to gain a political advantage. It was a conquest by starvation, pure and simple. There we were, in a landlocked city, trapped by the bear's paws. So it goes on. Ernest Bevin was the new British prime minister after Churchill. When he got news, he was very much, we're not going to give in. We're going to fight this, and we're going to defend West Berliners. Over in Washington, President Truman's response was similarly bullish. We're going to stay, period. He added that the Western allies in Berlin, quote, by the terms of an agreement, and that the Russians had no right to get us out either by direct or indirect pressure. Yet Hawley knew the situation on the ground was close to checkmate. Militarily, we didn't have a chance. The Russians could have moved into areas and liquidated us before we could say Politburo. The Western allies only had 2 battalions of troops inside the city, which would have been powerless against the Soviet panzer divisions. The odds were indeed stacked against the Western powers. The Soviet sector of Berlin, which is here, the Soviet sector, East Berlin, housed a garrison of 18,000 combat-ready troops, whereas the Western sectors could muster just 3,000 American troops, 2,000 British, and 1,500 French. This gave the Soviets a 3-to-1 advantage over the Western rivals. The Russians also had 300,000 soldiers camped out in Eastern Germany, for they had not demobilized their armies with the same speed as the Americans and the British. So basically, these soldiers, the American soldiers, were here just like a tripwire. There was no way they could defend a concerted attack. For one thing, they were surrounded on all 4 sides, and you had 5,000 or 6,000 soldiers against hundreds of thousands. They were there just as a tripwire, as symbolic. But they gambled that Stalin didn't want World War III, and their gamble was correct. The Allied sectors of the capital were particularly vulnerable to a surprise attack. The 341 square miles of Greater Berlin were crisscrossed with lines of the underground U-Bahn, that's subway, and overland S-Bahn, the train, now largely restored. There were no fewer than 158 commuter stations from which Red Army soldiers could pour into Western sectors. Districts like Kreuzberg, Tiergarten, and Wedding could be overrun within a matter of hours. Any defensive action on the part of the Allies would have been rapidly led to an all-out war with unpredictable consequences. So not only was the city surrounded, it had all these, bus stops, train stops, subway stops. The Russians could have come in very quickly, if they'd wanted to. Berlin's situation was different from all other sieges in one important respect. Only the western half of the city was blockaded, and Berliners could still cross into the Soviet sector. This is before the Berlin Wall. There was no wall here. You could just cross a street or take a train or a tram or a subway back and forth. There was no wall in 48. True, there was a marked increase in the number of checkpoints, more than 70 on the main crossing points, and the communist police were prone to confiscate food and goods. Yet the subway lines remained open, and the besieged inhabitants of the West were enticed into the Soviet sector by the promise of extra rations, quote, bread and potatoes and all the things a German likes, noted one British observer. This came at a cost. In order to claim those extra rations, inhabitants had to officially register with the Soviet military administration, a constraint that few were prepared to accept. Once registered, they'd be forever under the Soviet yoke. The situation seemed hopeless to most of the city's inhabitants as well as to the Western Allies. Howley alone harbored a ray of optimism for the showdown to follow. Although the Reds had succeeded in cutting us off completely by land, depriving us of the Autobahn, the highway, their railroads and the canals, he said, the blockade had one flaw. Moscow did not control the skies. There were 3 corridors here. See those corridors? The 3 air corridors to the capital had been agreed upon in writing back in 1945. The Soviets had no means of stopping the Allies from using these corridors short of shooting down their planes. This was something that Howley gambled they would not dare to do. Yet supplying 2.4 million inhabitants by air was logistically impossible, as his basic assumption plan had revealed. Absolutely everything needed importing: salt, milk, coal, potatoes, fat, sugar, medical supplies, and gasoline. It could not be done. Russia's insistence in 1945 that the Allies feed their own district of Berlin had given Howley a very precise idea of the city's daily needs. Every day, 641 tons of flour, 150 tons of cereal, not pounds, tons, 106 tons of meat and fish, 900 of potatoes, 51 of sugar, 10 of coffee, 20 of milk, 32 of fats, and 3 tons of yeast. He also knew exactly what was held in the city's warehouses: 17 days supply of flour, 32 days of cereal, 26 days of milk. But Berlin did not just require food. All fuel supplies had been stopped by the Soviets. Coal shipments to Berlin from the Soviet zone are halted, announced the Soviet-run ADN news agency in its transmission of June 23rd. The Soviet authorities have also ordered the central switching stations to stop the supply of electricity from the Soviet zone and Soviet sector to the Western sectors. Without coal, there could be no electricity. Without electricity, there could be no functioning sewage plants, no heating, no lighting, no clean water. Berlin's drinking water had to be pumped upward from deep underground aquifers through a natural filter of sand and gravel. If the pumps failed, the water supply would falter. Disease would run rampant and people would die. The Soviets had great experience with siege warfare, having been the besieged at Leningrad and Stalingrad and the besiegers at Budapest, Hungary. In blockading Berlin, they'd indeed created the perfect siege. And so in those early days, Americans and British, we had a few airplanes, not very many, small. A lot of them were still damaged from the war, in poor shape. Only a few planes scattered here and there. This is about now how the inhabitants took the news. The inhabitants of Berlin's western sectors absorbed news of the siege with a sense of impending doom. Harold Hayes took a tour around the British sector and found morale at a low ebb. Quote, There was black despair in some quarters and a kind of paralyzing hopeless resignation in others. Families were left reeling at, quote, the extraordinary and terrifying psychological shock of a sudden and complete blockade. This shock was compounded by the mixed messages coming from the Western Allied information departments, whose officials were convinced that an airlift, quote, could not possibly even begin to alleviate the problem into which they had been dragged against their will, let alone solve it. The effect of the Soviet blockade was instantaneous, as journalist Anthony Mann noted on his first evening. Quote, lights went out, machinery and pumping stations stopped, trains came to a halt. He was astonished that an entire metropolis could be so quickly brought to a standstill. Within hours, untreated sewage was flowing into the rivers and canals. Mann had written extensively about the city's infrastructure and knew more than most Berliners about the catastrophe that awaited them. Fully 89% of the West's electricity supply was generated in the East. Ernst Reuter, he later became West Berlin's first mayor. Ernst Reuter's plan to rebuild Kraftwerk West, the 228,000 kilowatt power plant at Spandau, had fallen on deaf ears. Now the Western sectors had just 2 small auxiliary generators to supply them with power. So no electricity, no coal, no food. Now this goes on about a man named Reginald Waite. He was a British air commander, Reginald Rex Waite, W-A-I-T-E. Waite had spent the previous weeks overseeing the import of essential army rations, 100 tons delivered each day by plane to the Western Allied garrisons, a mission with the unlikely code name Operation Knicker. It was derided by the Times of London, which remained firmly against an Allied airlift. Talk of an air bridge is merely picturesque. It's so interesting to hear so many people, with hindsight is 2020. We look back and say, wow, the Berlin airlift, so courageous, so bold, so successful. But many in the media and military were dead set against it. This book also mentions, I didn't mention to you earlier, but when Churchill went to Missouri and his famous Iron Curtain speech in, I believe, in 1946, it was widely condemned in the media. Wall Street Journal condemned it. Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's widow, condemned it. Oh, this is unrealistic and you're going to upset people and yada, yada, yada. Now we look back and realize, wow, the Iron Curtain speech was an act of prophecy. Churchill could see it coming. At the time, he was roundly condemned. So here's a thought. Sometimes if people think you're right, you may be wrong. If you're being criticized, you may be the right person. Just a thought. So this guy named Waite, even though the media was against an air bridge, he had a different opinion. He was exhilarated. Imagine this. Imagine being exhilarated. He was exhilarated by the scale of the crisis. I was determined to find a mathematical solution. Quote, 2.25 million people is a lot, he said. It's 22 times the size of Wembley Stadium full of people. Anyone who's seen Wembley's when it's full realizes it's only 100,000 people. That, by the way, is Roanoke City's population. We had 22 times that to feed and look at after every day, come fog and high water. So whereas most people would be scared by this prospect, thought it was impossible, this guy named Waite, he was exhilarated. It was like a challenge. So mindset is important. Waite identified 8 potential air bases in Western Germany that could be used to supply Berlin. The capital's district had 2 airfields, Gatow and Tempelhof, which would require radical upgrades if they were to support the intensity of traffic that Waite was envisioning. The runways were to be extended, the foundations backfilled with 2 feet of rubble, and the tarmac recycled from Berlin streets. When his team asked how tarmac could be recycled without specialist equipment, he had a ready answer: by pouring burning oil on it and then shoving the tarmac off the hot street and putting it on top of the stones. So he found these, there are 8 airports here and Berlin. So Tempelhof was in the American section, Gatow was in the British section. Later, they built Tegel in the French section. So they eventually had 3 airports. So you have planes leaving 8 airports, flying these set corridors, hoping and praying they would be shot down. None They never were. Landing here. Amazing. Eight outbound airports and 2 inbound airports offer the possibility for a huge number of flights. Wade computed that Qatar alone could handle 288 flights a day, allowing for 2.5 minutes for each aircraft. And that involves taxiing out, getting off the runway, taking off, and getting a safe distance clear at the far end of the runway before another could be told to come in. Wow, 2.5 minutes per aircraft. Rapid unloading would be crucial. Wade wanted lorries, which means trucks, stationed alongside the runway, engines running in readiness for their cargoes of food and fuel. The fuel would be driven to a barge, which would receive its cargo by means of 6 chutes. Wade wanted each barge to be moving forward as it passed under the chutes, so as not to waste precious seconds. His system had to work with absolute precision, and he was confident it could break the siege, just so long as enough spare planes could be gathered from across the globe. When he explained his plan to General Herbert, he was given the cold shoulder. It can't possibly work, Herbert snapped. He got a similar response from General Robertson, who thought it was, quote, impossible. The British general said no. But when he showed his plan to Lucius Clay, the American general, he got a very different reaction. Clay read through Wade's blueprint, thought for a moment, then read it a second time. Suddenly his face lit up. Okay, he said with a smile, I'm with you. And with those words, the Berlin airlift was on. Now, the next catch was this. There are only a few airplanes here in Europe. So the cry went out. Obviously, England's empire was huge, scattered across the globe. And so the cry went out to flights, in remote places, Honolulu, Hawaii, Johnston Atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, California, Alaska, Massachusetts, Alabama. The cry was, go to Berlin. Your planes are needed. Your services are needed. Now, so they begin flying in supplies to Berlin. There you have flour. So imagine 1 plane every 2.5 minutes at 1 airport, times 2 airports and later 3 airports. Now let's fast forward to July. We're a month into the siege. So by this point, the food in the warehouses are almost all gone. On the 28th day of the siege, July 22nd, Lucius Clay, that's the general overseeing Berlin, American general, was summoned from Berlin to Washington for emergency discussions with President Truman and his National Security Council. The meeting was scheduled to take place at 11 o'clock in the morning in the cabinet room of the White House. And there was only one subject on the agenda, Berlin. All the most important figures were in attendance, including the 3 Joint Chiefs of Staff, with General Omar Bradley representing the Army, General Hoyt Vandenberg, the Air Force, and Vice Admiral Arthur Radford, the Navy. Here's the kicker. Everyone present had previously expressed opposition to any expansion of the airlift, believing it to be an unachievable operation that would end in humiliation for America. Clay, the general who had never done battle, now found himself in combat with the most experienced commanders in the American Armed Forces. So early in the book, it mentions how Clay, he was a general, but he was what you call in the Civil War an armchair general. He was in charge of, he was brilliant at planning and logistics, and that was important. It was crucial in World War II, but he had never been involved in combat. So here's this armchair general, who knew warfare is kind of an abstraction, facing these battle-hardened generals who've been in combat, trying to persuade them. Matters were not helped by the fact that Clay was suffering from the onset of lumbago and experiencing such excruciating back pain, he could scarcely turn his head. Yet he valiantly took on the big guns of Washington, single-handedly fighting for a massive expansion of the airlift. So it had begun very small at first. His opening words reminded everyone of what was at stake. Quote, Mr. President and gentlemen, he began, the abandonment of Berlin would be a serious, if not a disastrous blow to the maintenance of freedom in Europe. He warned that Stalin's troops would swiftly overrun in territories vacated by the Americans and point out that the airlift was already achieving miracles, with 80 C-47s and 52 C-54s flying 250 round trips each day. These are bringing in some 2,500 tons of food, a little more than half what was needed. 2 months ago, the Russians were cocky and arrogant, said Clay. Now they're going, quote, out of the way to avoid incidents. The airlift, along with Howley's fiery radio broadcasts, was having an effect. Having finished with the preliminaries, Clay launched an impassioned plea for more planes. And this is the point at which he ran into difficulties. He told the assembled generals he needed to expand his fleet to 207 aircraft, which would require an immediate addition of 75 C-54s if they were to save Berlin from starvation. There was an audible gasp in the room as everyone digested his words. Then, with the cautious conservatism of a senior commander, the Air Force Chief of Staff, General Vandenberg, refused Clay's request point blank. That's more than half our fleet, he said. The general warned that these planes could easily be destroyed in the ground in the event of a war with the Soviet Union, and added that the diversion of so many aircraft to Berlin would, quote, seriously impair America's ability to wage strategic warfare. So Clay's thinking big, saying, hey, if we put more than half our planes in Berlin, what if there's an attack, like a Pearl Harbor sneak attack, or there's a war elsewhere, and our planes are here in Germany, we can't do that. Clay sidestepped Vandenberg's concern and reminded everyone of what was at stake. If we move out of Berlin, we've lost everything we've been fighting for. The airlift has increased our prestige immeasurably. He said it was not only a question of saving lives, the German capital had become, quote, a symbol of American intent. Truman said little, although he acknowledged Vandenberg's alarm about sending more planes to Berlin. After briefly reviving Clay's previous idea of sending an armed convoy, he returned to the central problem: how to stay in Berlin without risking all-out war. No one had an answer. Yeah, so Clay at one time said, hey, let's just get our tanks there and just kind of roll across and force our way in. Truman said, no, that sounds like a World War III. We're not going to go there. The president rose from his seat and announced that he had another appointment scheduled in his diary. The Berlin meeting was to continue with Secretary of State Marshall in the chair. Clay felt the battle was lost, for, quote, the Joint Chiefs and everybody else was opposed. The only person in the room who might possibly have championed his cause, President Truman, was leaving. As Truman swept out the cabinet room, he turned to Clay and said, drop in by my office before you leave, General. Clay returned to the White House the following morning, shortly before catching his flight back to Berlin. It was a sparkling summer's day, and sunlight was tilting through the windows of Truman's office. But Clay's mood was downcast, and not just because of his lumbago. You look like you feel badly, General, Truman said. Mr. President, I'm very disappointed. Without those planes, I just don't think we're going to make it in Berlin. Truman looked up from his desk and smiled broadly. Oh, you're going to get them, he said. I've just overruled the Joint Chiefs. So in our system, the president is commander-in-chief. And so even though all the military brass are saying it's impossible to do it, Truman said, yes, we will make this thing happen. That's Harry Truman. Okay, let's go on now. Page 273. So meanwhile, so the planes are coming in. The Berliners quickly realized, hey, this is our salvation. While these planes are coming in, this is where our food is coming from, and coal and milk and medicine. And so very quickly, the Berlin population was very obviously in favor of this airlift. How ironic. Up until 1945, Berlin was Hitler's capital, our arch enemy. Within 3 years, they were our allies, and they were begging for our help. So during the blockade, there had been much talk of evacuating the spouses and dependents of American families living in Berlin, as it would decrease the quantity of supplies needed to be flown in. So a lot of times these top generals, they brought their wives and even children over to live with them. Howley was strongly against the course of action, lest it send an unwelcome signal to Berliners. Quote, it was necessary that they stick it out. if for no other reason than to serve as a symbol of American determination not to be driven from Berlin, saying the wives and dependents will not leave. Yet many Western Allied dependents were worried about the future, especially when the Soviet-run newspapers printed rumors that the same Asiatic troops who had sacked the city in 1945 were being returned to active duty. One Walter Ulbricht loyalist, he was the German communist, went so far as to declare that when the Red Army seized the western sectors of Berlin, quote, American families would be held in concentration camps for further disposition. As Howley noted, curtly, everyone knew what that meant, basically raping women, killing the men. Edith Howley's fears for the future were not assuaged by her husband's abrupt manner of expressing himself. Quote, you know we don't have a chance if the Russians come in, he told her one evening when tensions were running high. I'll be killed. And you know what'll happen to you? Mrs. Howley nodded gravely. The Russians will throw me to the regiment. Yet she refused to leave, as did most other American dependents. British spouses also declined to leave the city. Over at 10 Hohmannstrasse, General Robertson's wife, also named Edith, instructed her butler to keep the family silver polished and displayed on the sideboard. It was her little way of showing visitors that she had no intention of quitting Berlin. So think about that. It's amazing. This woman, Edith Robertson, she just kept the silver out on a piece of furniture and told the butler to keep it polished. That was her rebellion. That was her way of saying, we're not leaving. The family silver is here. We're staying put. Even little things of defiance and boldness. It's amazing. Yet she was nervous about the future, especially when she heard rumors of an imminent Soviet attack on the western sectors. Journalist Kurt Reese went to investigate these rumors and was alarmed to discover the Soviet tanks were carrying out maneuvers on the city's outskirts. By afternoon, he said, they are parked in a semicircle around West Berlin. So tensions increased yet further when Walter Ulbricht was spotted making his way to Soviet headquarters in Karlhorst, where it was said he demanded the tanks continue on into the city itself. The besieged sectors of Western Berlin looked to be on the brink of invasion, yet it still did not materialize. Allied intelligence agents informed Reese there was good reason for this. Stalin had warned both Sokolevsky and Kotikov, his generals, not to push the game of brinksmanship too far. Quote, there must be no shooting in Berlin's western sectors. So it was all just psychological warfare. You know, West Berlin was very, very small, could have been taken over in a few hours. So Stalin had his tanks, his troops there, but Stalin also did not want World War III. And even though there were only a few thousand Western soldiers here, he knew attacking could very likely trigger World War III. That's why Truman said, we're leaving our people here. We're not going to, we're not going to shoot our way in. That would trigger a war, but we're not going to give up either. We'll keep flying. We'll pay the price, whatever it costs, to fly in and keep this area supplied. Yes, so no shooting war, thank goodness, but it was very close. Let's now talk about the propaganda value. So as the blockade goes on month by month, and the world realized, wow, that West Berlin is not surrendered. The people are not starving to death. The Western Allies began to triumph in the propaganda war, with General Tunner playing an important role. General Tunner, which is an ironic name for tonnage. Okay, he was in charge at the end of the airlift. Most Allied officers argued that daily tonnage figures should be kept secret, but Tunner had scented the propaganda value of advertising them. Quote, I not only wanted them unclassified, I wanted to publicize them, shout them from the housetops. If Colonel Tyopanov could play the propaganda game, then so could he. Indeed, Tunner saw the airlift as part of a wider strategy to win the hearts and minds of Berliners. If the Berlin airlift was to be successful, and I never had any doubt that it would be, then it'd be more than just an airlift. It'd be a propaganda weapon held up before the whole world. We should not hide it. This we're going to have kind of a lengthy reading here, but this is also an amazing piece of the Berlin Airlift. The second propaganda coup that winter began in unlikely fashion. This is winter of 48-49. So the blockade began in June. By that winter, it's still going on. You know how cold it is. They needed coal for heat, electricity. So there was a 28-year-old Mormon named Lieutenant Gale Halverson. He was chatting with a group of emaciated children huddled by the Tempelhof perimeter fence. That's the airport. In broken English, they told him how they liked to watch the never-ending convoy of planes coming to land. At one point, they had like planes every 90 seconds in and out. Halverson was struck by the fact that none of the children begged him for candy, as they'd always done during his wartime service in Africa. Filled with admiration for their self-restraint, he delved into his pockets and pulled out 2 sticks of gum, which he divided up as best he could. They looked like they'd gotten $1 million, he said. They just couldn't believe it. Those who didn't get any gum gratefully received the wrapper, which they divided into pieces and licked with relish. Their gratitude sparked an idea that was to have far-reaching consequences. Come back tomorrow, Halverson told them. I'll drop enough so you can all have some gum. He said he would wiggle the wings of his aircraft, his C-54, during its final approach to Tempelhof, so they would know it was him, and then toss the candy out the parachute exit. That evening, he asked his co-pilot engineer for their candy rations and spent the rest of the night making little parachutes so the candy would float gently to the ground. On the following day, he spied the same group of children at the perimeter fence and duly dropped his candy. On the subsequent day, there were even more children who received a much larger delivery. And their numbers continued to grow until there were more than 100 of them waiting their bounty. When Halverson returned to his Rhine-Main air base at the end of the week, he was told there's a huge sack of mail awaiting him. The envelopes of these letters were decorated with sketches of sky masters dropping candy-bearing parachutes. Some were addressed to Onkel Wackelflügel, Uncle Waggle Wings, others to Der Schokoladenflieger, the chocolate flyer. We're in real trouble, Halverson told his co-pilot, aware that such a stack of mail would not have gone unnoticed by the authorities. Sure enough, he was soon summoned to a dressing down with the commanding officer, Colonel John Hown. Halverson, what have you been doing? Flying like mad, sir. I'm not stupid. What else have you been doing? Halverson confessed everything, fully expecting to be court-martialed, but there was a very different outcome. Colonel Hahn, quote, reached under the counter, pulled out a German newspaper, threw it down in front of me, and there was an airplane on the front page with parachutes coming out of it. A smile spread over the colonel's face. You almost hit a German newspaper guy in the head with a candy bar in Berlin yesterday. And he's got the story all over the whole world. Far from having him court-martialed, Colonel Hown ordered Halverson to drop candy in far greater quantities. General Tunner himself had grasped the propaganda value of what was swiftly dubbed, quote, Operation Little Vittles, a public relations masterstroke that could be deployed with devastating effect against the Soviets. As a good news story, it was hard to beat. Smiling children devouring huge quantities of candy supplied by caring pilots of the U.S. Air Force. The news spread rapidly across the globe, gaining widespread coverage in the local, national, and international newspapers. Soon, radio stations across the U.S. took up the cause, launching appeals for handkerchiefs to be turned into parachutes. Send in a handkerchief and we'll play your request tune. Halverson was flown back to the States to appear on the popular radio show, We the People. The response from the millions of listeners to that program was fantastic, said General Tunner, who was carefully monitoring the effect of the propaganda. Halverson's unit, the 17th Air Transport Squadron, was daily flooded with candy and handkerchiefs for parachutes by the generous American people, as well as from some candy manufacturers. When Halverson began receiving begging letters from children in East Berlin, Tunner realized he was onto something big. He now encouraged Halverson to drop candy into the Soviet sector as well, aware it would enrage General Katakov, the Russian general. The Soviet military administration was indeed furious at this simple yet successful stunt, and it issued a blistering complaint to the State Department in Washington, slamming the candy drops as, quote, a capitalist trick and a military operation to alienate the minds of these young people against our system. Halverson's candy mission was to run throughout the spring and was an undisputed triumph. It had infuriated the Soviets, delighted Berliners, and transformed wavering public opinion in the United States. The San Francisco Chronicle celebrated one of Halverson's publicity trips to America with an editorial demanding that Congress increase its financial support for the airlift. A pivotal operation like the Berlin airlift, the Peeps read, is not the place to start economizing. On the contrary, we consider it would be cheap at 10 times the price. So the candy, the Schokoladenflieger, the candy, the chocolate flyers. Okay. Woo. Okay. So meanwhile, so we're flying food in. There was also a very, very active black market. Keep in mind, as I said earlier, this is the only siege in world history that's only for half of the city. Okay. So this side and this side, they could go back and forth. And there was a lot of black market exchanging back and forth. By this point, the Western zone had a new Western currency, which was worth more money. And the East wanted that money. When I was in Germany in 85, 86, much later, of course, it was illegal. If you exchanged Western marks for Eastern marks, you'd be put in jail. So I dare not do that. But when I was there in the 80s, I changed my marks legally at the communist money changing places. One West mark for one East mark. But if you did it, under the table, it could be, I got like 4 or 5 to 1. Okay. So there was an active black market. So at the same time that food was being smuggled into the Western zone, the Eastern zone of Germany found itself in dire economic straits. Throughout the early months of the blockade, the Soviet military administration had continued to receive reparations from Western occupied Germany, including supplies of coal and iron signed off at the Potsdam Conference. So in other words, at Potsdam, there's this agreement that yes, Western Germany would keep sending coal and iron to the Soviet sector. Well, now Frank Hawley reneged on these agreements and launched a full-scale counter blockade. So his rationale was, wait a minute, at Potsdam, we agreed we'd have these, coal and iron go to you, but we also agreed, on free elections and a lot of things, access to the city. And so he's saying, hey, Russians, if you're going to renege on the promises, then so can we. The door swings both ways, and we'll just stop delivering you coal and iron. So, you're going to play hardball with us, we'll be nasty with you as well, basically. All righty. Well, this blockade went on for 11 months, from June of 48 until May of 49. And what helped bring it to an end was Easter. Easter that year was in April, and General Tunner wanted another propaganda victory. I mean, it's wrong to use Easter for that purpose, but anyway, he said, we're going on Easter weekend, we're going to break all records from noon Saturday until noon Sunday. We're going to break all delivery records. You got the biggest planes in there, planes nonstop 24/7. And then on Sunday afternoon, they announced how much tonnage had been brought in, and sure enough, they'd broken all records. And so it's very clear that yes, the Berlin airlift was working. Very expensive. A lot of pilots died flying in. Berlin is notorious for a lot of fog. The winter was bad. Sometimes the Russians never shot planes down, but they would sometimes shoot what are called tracer bullets between the planes. I mean, every 90 seconds of a plane, they were like stacked up, and they'd shoot these tracer bullets between the planes just to intimidate and distract the pilots, to frighten them. But and so many did crash and die. But by May, Stalin realized, okay, I'm losing the propaganda war. So let's go ahead and read now about the end of the blockade. So the Russians send the message that we're going to stop the blockade. This is now page 302 in Checkmate in Berlin. On the night the siege came to an end, thousands drove to the British-American Autobahn checkpoint that marked the frontier post of the city's allied sectors. So what that means is there was a highway, it's still there. I was on it a few times in the 80s, a highway from Berlin to Hanover. And the highway goes out, here on the west end of the city. So when the blockade ended at midnight, allegedly, it was going to end, many people went to that checkpoint just to wait and see, is this really going to happen? Will there really be stuff coming in? All wanted to glimpse the first vehicle to arrive from the west. Everybody was there, said Kurt Reese. Actresses, beauty queens, boxers, six-day bicycle racers, famous writers, scientists. Many of the women wore full evening dress, while the men were in black tie. A phalanx of reporters from the international press had also assembled, along with cameramen and sound crews. American, British, and French cars were parked everywhere. Berlin had not partied for 4 long years. Now everyone was determined to have fun. As midnight approached, everyone was anxiously counting the seconds. At exactly 1 minute past the hour, the city lights in West Berlin snapped into life in accordance with the negotiated settlement. The Soviets had switched on the main power that reconnected West Berlin to the gigantic Klingenberg power station in the eastern zone. Klingenberg was over here in this area. At the exact same moment, 110 miles to the west, floodlights lit up the Helmstedt border crossing. So here's Hanover, the city. Helmstedt is the German city nearest the border on the western side. And again, when I was in Munster here in this part of Germany, about this area, I guess, and I went through Hanover and Helmstedt on the Autobahn. So at midnight, the lights come back on in West Berlin, and this border crossing was opened for the first time in 11 months. The wooden barriers that had blocked the Berlin Autobahn for 323 days were lifted by the border guards, and the assembled press correspondents rushed to their vehicles and fired the engines. The race was on. Everyone wanted to be the first to reach the crowds known to be waiting in the capital. So the idea is these people here in the West, mid-1201, hop in their cars, they're driving across 110 miles across communist territory to get to here. Who will be first to West Berlin and meet the waiting crowds? According to one observer, it was a moment charged with emotion. As the landing jeeps of an Allied convoy passed under the Soviet barrier, to the accompanying of much saluting, girls broke through the cordon with tears of joy running down their faces to throw arms of lilacs into the laps of British and American servicemen. There were equally delirious scenes as the first Allied military train entered the Soviet zone in the glare of cinema floodlights. So again, keep in mind, during these 323 days, not only was this highway closed, but the trains to West Berlin were closed, as were the canals. It was totally shut off except for the air. This marked the beginning of a vast supply operation. A further 20 trains were soon rolling across Soviet-occupied German lands toward the capital that night, full of food, fuel, and mail. Trains and vehicles alike were draped with flags, American, British, and French, and given a triumphal send-off with a band of British troops giving a lusty rendition of "It's a Long Way to Tipperary." That was a British World War I song. At the end of the Berlin, at the Berlin end of the Autobahn, that's here on this part here. Okay. The ever-growing multitude in Western Berlin strained necks and eyes as they peered in the darkness in the hope of glimpsing the first vehicle to arrive from Helmstedt. Everybody wanted proof, tangible proof, that their ordeal was finally at an end. So who will see this first convoy coming across East Germany or Eastern Germany, Soviet sector, into Berlin? Half an hour passed, then an hour, and the crowd grew anxious and impatient. But at precisely 1:46 a.m., the glare of headlamps could be seen through the darkness. The lead vehicle in the pack was a gray Ford convertible driven by United Press correspondent Walter Rundle. As he drew a halt, the crowd mobbed his vehicle, pulled open the doors, and thrust a wreath of roses around his neck. For Rundle, it was the finest reception he'd ever received. He stepped out onto the road, his sharp Hollywood suit gleaming in the glare of the headlights, and gave a commanding wave to the crowd. They responded with a roar of approval, greeting him like a hero. Rondo was soon joined by dozens more journalists and cars, followed by the first convoy of lorries, their high bonnets bedecked with garlands of spring branches. Bonnet in British English means the hood of the car, hood of the truck. Okay. At long last, Berliners were convinced the blockade was truly at an end. Harold Hayes spent much of that night in the office of General Geoffrey Bourne, the British commander. It was approaching dawn when their meeting took an unexpected turn. The general, quote, suddenly cupped his hand behind his ear to listen, and he grinned beatifically at the sound of a shrill, penetrating blast which came shrieking through the air. After listening for a moment, he said, "It's a grand sound." What he and Hayes had just heard was the whistle of the first goods train to steam into Charlottenburg Station, pulling a huge line of food-laden wagons. Quote, that shrieking whistle was one of the most audible heralds which announced the end of one of the most brutal blockades in history, said Hayes. Quote, it was unquestionably the sweetest music we had heard for a great many months. The train whistle, the trains are coming in now also. Hayes felt he was living through a key moment in European history, one that would forever change the world. Quote, the vicious Berlin blockade had been completely broken by the stubbornness and grim determination of the Berliners and the Western allies alike, and by the effectiveness of the counter-blockade. He also felt that the breaking of the siege had a profound psychological significance, for it had shattered, quote, the last vestiges of respect which any freedom-loving individual could possibly have held for Soviet Russians or the German communists. The very idea of Soviet rule in West Berlin was now unthinkable. Their written and spoken word was now in such bad repute that no further reliance could be placed on anything they said or did. And here's a picture of that next day, trucks coming in. You see the flowers here on the, trucks, tops of the trucks, the bonnets, the hoods, ladies, up there smiling, little kids. That says Berlin, Hanover. So again, there's Berlin, there's Hanover. So it shows the first Berlin, Hanover convoy. Hurrah, wir leben noch means hooray, we're still alive. We're still alive. Look at the happy, happy crowd. Here's a cartoon showing this Berlin blockade broken down. You see the Russian flag in the background, meaning the Russians were behind the blockade. Also, kind of looked like a surrender flag. The blockade was broken. It had actually failed. Here's a newspaper from Hartford, Connecticut. Kind of hard to see, but it says, blockade ended as trains, autos speed to and from jubilant Berlin. Russia turns electricity back on. So that would have been from the lifting the blockade. There's some kids there. It says blockadenfrei, which means free of the blockade or free from the blockade. Blockadenfrei. So there's a newspaper from that time. So they were just, everyone's so thrilled to have the blockade over. Ernst Reuter was the first mayor of West Berlin. And they had a big grandstand and a parade to celebrate the blockade being over. Ernst Reuter declared May 12th a public holiday, and he addressed a crowd of 300,000 Berliners. 300,000 Berliners came to hear him speak. Sharing the grandstand with Reuter that day was Frank Howley, who felt he was witnessing a turning point in history. He remarked to one of the nearby staff that the massed crowd fully deserved the triumph, for they had shown themselves, quote, willing to suffer and die for democracy. As we say, freedom is not free, and these Berliners suffered terribly for it. They could have gotten their bread and butter and eggs or whatever, milk, and submitted to communism. They chose not to. The most immediate reward for the inhabitants of West Berlin was a massive influx of food and supplies at affordable prices. In the long months since the Western Allies currency reform, the economies of Germany's Western zones had undergone a dramatic lift. Shows you the beauty of capitalism. With capitalism, Western Germany grew very quickly. The wholesalers had been waiting for months for the end of the blockade, said Kurt Rees. As soon as it was lifted, They sent everything transportable to Berlin. Berliners flocked to the stores and bought huge quantities of food and ate it in a fashion that had not been possible for years. Pork, cod, butter, eggs, coffee, all were once again available after 4 years of hardship. Reese described the days that followed the end of the blockade as, quote, orgies of gluttony. So lots of overeating, and who can blame them? General Clay ended up leaving Berlin for a good 3 days at the end of the blockade. And then not long after, also Frank Howley left as well. And early on, it was Howley who said the Russians are a real threat. Clay was obeying DC, saying, no, we need to get along with the Russians. But when all was said and done, they were on the same page. General Clay realized what a threat the Russians had been, and they left as good friends. So that goes on to one last little story. One thing that makes Mr. Giles Milton a great author is his way of including these little snippets, little stories. And the four powers shared power in a group called the Commandatura. And they take turns hosting it, and whoever's in charge was supposed to provide a huge meal and alcohol for everybody else. Okay. So Hawley ended up leaving in September. Okay. And Hawley packed up his villa in Dahlem at the beginning of September and prepared to take his wife and children back to America aboard the Army transport vessel Maurice Rose. But he first went to say farewell to his most persistent enemy. I rather think that Katakov will remember our farewell, he wrote. That was the Russian general. The Kommandatura had just concluded its meeting, and as a departing chairman, I was host at the inevitable buffet in the next room. As he left the chamber for the final time, he allowed himself a brief moment to reflect on the constant sparring with his Soviet opposite number, a feud that had taken a physical toll on them both. Quote, my 4 years in Berlin gave me gray hair, Howley said, but I have the satisfaction I gave him stomach ulcers. Now he was to give these ulcers a final parting gift. As a waiter offered a tray of drinks, Katakov confessed he was in too much pain to drink his usual vodka. A gleeful Howley recounted in his memoirs what happened next. Champagne, someone asked. Katakov puffed his cheeks and shook his head. Makes me belch, he said. Have a martini, I said shrewdly. What is a martini? Katakov asked. I pointed the lethal drink on the tray. Innocently, Katakov picked it up. I took champagne. Katakov raised his glass. To my astonishment, he gulped the entire contents of the glass, martini, olive, and all. A look of wonder crossed his face. I proposed a toast. Another martini clanked down to the Russian's ulcers. There were 2 more toasts and 2 more rapid martinis for Katakov. I looked at him curiously. His disarmingly cherubic face was twisted. Obviously, his stomach was on fire. I nodded toward another martini. Niet, he gasped, meaning no. Okay. So what a great author Giles Morton is. These little funny stories. That was Colonel Howley's final meeting with his Russian counterpart, General Katakov. Okay, stay tuned. One more to look at. We'll look at now post Berlin airlift. Look at the Berlin Wall, East-West Berlin, East-West Germany, NATO, Warsaw Pact. That'll be our last section. Thanks for watching, everybody.